Go. Hi, Niamh, and welcome to visit us. Thank you for visiting us today. We're delighted to have you here, and really, it's about talking to you about your wonderful book and your whole experience of Sheriff Street when you were producing your PhD, which I think is what you said to me that it was for. Um, what were your initial experiences of going down to Sheriff Street?
Well, I suppose initially I didn't know what to expect. All I knew was what I had been told, which was that I shouldn't be going there on my own. And my mum was a Dub, and she grew up on the north side of Dublin as well. And when I said where I was going, she was a bit concerned, and she was, saying, "Well, who's going to go with you, and why are you going there, and why would you go there? There's nothing to see." But I was really conscious that I wanted to understand what was going on in communities that were undergoing significant change. So that's why I wanted to go, and I suppose I was a little bit anxious. My first experience of going to Sheriff Street was being surrounded by lots of small children just running around. And then going back, and I had a really, I suppose, profound experience where I was walking down the street on my own, and I was a little bit terrified because of what I had been told. And I saw a group of teenagers, and they were all standing around this kind of oil barrel, and it was lit, and they were all standing around, and I didn't know what to do, and I was like, should I go forward or should I go back? And they stopped and asked me what I was doing, so I thought, well, here I am, I'll just tell them. So I explained that I was interested in the changes going on in their community and what they were doing and what they felt about it, and they were so welcoming. It was like a completely different experience, and it really taught me a lesson, and that lesson was, it's okay to be afraid, but you need to really understand people and recognise the importance of people and individuals and their communities. And I suppose that stuck with me since then. It's been, don't prejudge and don't judge a book by its cover.
Sure. That's really interesting. And also, I guess, there are massive changes that have gone on in the Docklands area, apart from the collapse in the 70s, which led to, I think, years and years of depression and unemployment. But I'm interested in, because I'm sure everybody in the Docklands was hopeful about what it would bring to them in the community. What did you think would happen? What are your insights about this whole development and the impact it had on the community?
I think there's a few phases of it, and I suppose the place to start is really with kind of what happened in the 70s and the collapse of port work, and really a lot of people were really dependent not just on the port itself but on all the kind of ancillary activities that went around it. So when that happened and when that collapse happened, it was really devastating for entire families and generations of families, because one of the things I discovered was that this was like an activity that kind of went down the generations, that people passed the kind of skills of stevedoring and so on all the way down through different generations. So that was the huge impact. And then I think that the kind of difficulties really started to emerge when you had Tony Gregory really trying to fight for a deal for the community. And I suppose that's the first alarm bells, that he recognised something was changing and really the community needed an advocate. So that was really the first thing. And then when you start seeing what was going on in other cities, similarly, which had lost their port activities, and the kind of changes that were happening there, I suppose there was a bit of concern for what would happen for the community, because yes, jobs were needed and investment was needed. But I think one of the things that really strikes me is the types of changes that come to these places are really more about national economies and the city as a whole and creating employment in general. But what actually happens to the communities in the immediate environs can be very different, and they can become much more sidelined. And all of those issues that emerge as a result of that sort of unemployment and the antisocial behaviour in some cases that came with that, none of that was being addressed because it was very much property led, following a model that's really been seen in many other cities around the world.
So I guess all these changes must have come to the community with great hope and many promises that they were going to suddenly benefit from all of this. And do you think that's how it turned out?
No, I think it didn't turn out in a very positive way in many cases for people who've lived there for generations. Partly because the first kind of 10 years of development were all about financial services and placing Ireland in this global economy and the boom and the emergence of the boom. And while there was kind of lip service to what would happen to the community, there was no focus on that. It was all about physical and kind of economic regeneration in general, rather than that for those who really needed employment in the local area, and no safeguards in place. And I think in the mid-90s that started to change a little bit, again as part of this broader kind of what we might call a turn to community, where people recognised that community was important, and actually if you wanted your development to be a success, you actually had to get involved and get community involved. And I think the community had a stronger voice from the mid-90s perhaps to the mid-2000s, but certainly not the dominant voice, and still experienced many issues that could have been addressed a bit more successfully if the balance of development had been a bit better.
I think being part of a marginalised community is particularly difficult, and it is very difficult to find a voice. Were there people who stand out for you who had voices in that on behalf of the community?
I think so. I mean, one of the things that always strikes me about somewhere like Sheriff Street is the absolute strength of people within the community. So people like Jerry Fay, for example, who have given their lives to serving the community. Somebody else that strikes me is Betty Ash, who's a powerhouse in St Andrew's Resource Centre. Incredible people who are standing up for the community and really active voices on the community liaison committees that were set up. And I do think they managed to get some really, really good wins for the community.
Okay.
So, for example, I would say things like the 10% employment charter that had to go in the mid-90s to make sure that people from the area got jobs in the area. But also things like, I suppose, return to education and promoting education in the community, which is, of course, the gateway to people, prospering and actually being able to develop themselves.
So did you have concerns about the community and the impact of it, or what was your experience of that?
I think I did have concerns, and I do have concerns still. I mean, this isn't finished, and I think that's something that's really important to remember. Today I drove across the East Link Bridge and I looked down the river where all this development is taking place. And the scale of it is absolutely phenomenal. And I do know that we need more compact growth for sustainable cities, but the scale of what's going on in one part of the city is really quite terrifying, I think, in some ways. And it's partly because we see that part of Dublin as a brownfield, and what people don't understand is that there are so many people who still live there and have lived there. And don't want to be surrounded by 20-storey buildings. So this is an ongoing story, and I think there needs to be, for the future of the area, there needs to be a sense of community being rebuilt, and that can be very difficult when there's so much transformation of such a dramatic scale going on.
I think one of the concerns I had was that actually the resilience, the natural resilience that is part and parcel of that community might be eroded. And it's certainly not been our experience when we've done the project that it has been eroded, but it is very difficult. But do you have concerns yourself for the long-term impact of the development on the community?
Well, I think the older community that's been there, I suppose the traditional community, if you want to call it that, is actually so small now, that's a real kind of threat to who will remember. And I think unless you have people who remember what it was like, then it's actually very difficult to sustain and be resilient. And particularly, I've spoken to younger people who lived in the community, and they didn't give their address of where they lived, so they were almost ashamed of their identity and where they came from. So until that kind of resilience and strength in who they are and where they're from can come back, then the memory of Sheriff Street and what it was will actually disappear.
What's your hope for the community going forward?
My hope is that the traditional community and what they've given to that area can be recognised. I think one of the things that needs to be done is that the area needs to be destigmatised. So we need to remember the good, and that's where this project, I think, is really powerful. As well as perhaps some of the negative press that the area got in the late 80s. And in many cases it was due to neglect by government and by state agencies who really didn't support the community very well at that time. But I also think the lessons of those people of strength can carry on into a new generation. And while the city has to change, what would be lovely would be to see that the history of those traditional communities recognised in a really meaningful way, and to ensure that the new people who are moving to the area get integrated, and that there isn't these walls maintained between the old and the new, but rather there's a sort of a new emerging vibrant community that actually recognises and values all the histories on the street.
Yeah. It is interesting the point you're making, though, about how it feels like a wedge gets driven into these polarized positions where it's them and us, both from the new people coming in and from the people who have been there for generations. And I guess having boundary walls, like the boundary wall, is not conducive to integration within a community. Would you agree?
Yeah, completely. I think that boundary wall is one of the biggest mistakes that was made. It was meant to come down as part of the original plan, and in fact, it got increased in height. And really sends a message. I think these walls, we have invisible walls, but we also have these very physical walls that really reinforce that of difference. And I think in a world where it is so diverse, that what we need to be doing is physically taking these walls down and just reintegrating and using things like open space and green space and creating communal areas where different communities can coexist. I think that's really how you make a great city.
Is that your hope for the community?
That's my hope for the community.
Well, it is about pride of place, and thank you so much for coming in to talk to us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.